Now, these are the kind of scenes that you may expect in Somalia, in Mosul in Iraq, or Kabul in Afghanistan. The last place you'll expect an insurrection or a riot of this kind is in Washington, D.C. at Capitol Hill. It's before this inconceivable. What does this rioting mean for America's standing in the global community? Does this hasten America's decline and speed up China's rise? Will America be able to recover from the chaos unleashed by Donald Trump? Joining me on the Newstrack, I want to welcome first and foremost Navteej Sarna. He's been India's ambassador to the United States between 2016 and 18. Those are the first 2 years of the Donald Trump administration, has worked closely with President Trump and his government. We have Professor Sumit Ganguly, a distinguished professor of political science. He joins us from the Indiana University in Bloomington. We've got Sadanand Dhume. He's a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute from Washington, D.C. Sadanand has been trolled extensively for putting out several weeks ago a post on Twitter which spoke of how something like this would never happen, and that is unfortunately exactly what's going to happen, which is clearly beyond the imagination of those who are living in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. We've got Dr. Rick Mehta. Last year he became the first Indian American to win the Republican primary for the Senate seat from the U.S. state of New Jersey. He's a biotech entrepreneur and healthcare policy expert. I want to go across to Sadanand first because you've really got a bit of pasting on social media for suggesting that this would never happen, and that is exactly what we saw play out. An insurrection, a riot of a kind that was unimaginable in Washington. It's still too early, we're still in the moment, but what, according to you, is the larger message this is sent about America's present state to the rest of the world?
Look, Rahul, thank you for having me on your show. Getting a pasting on Twitter is perfectly fair. I hold no grudge against the people who decided to sort of pull up this tweet of mine from early November. The truth is that back in November, I was based my prediction on an orderly transfer of power on more than 200 years of American history. This was clearly unimaginable to me, and it was very unimaginable, I would argue, to most people, not just in the United States, but all over the world. This country has always been marked by a peaceful transfer of power, maybe not counting the Civil War years, but in general, going back right to the founding. These are, they're just fundamental aspects of American democracy. This obviously has been marred by the unfortunate events that we saw yesterday. But I would like to sort of point out to your viewers that there is one very big difference between Somalia and some of these other countries that you mentioned, which is that, yes, the mob did invade, and no one should minimize that. But within a few hours, the normal business of the Congress did resume, and Joe Biden was certified as President of the United States, and he will be sworn in on January 20th. So this is the sort of chaotic thing one does not associate with America, but it's not as though the chaos in the end has prevailed over order.
Ambassador Sarna, it's almost as if you've got one very big part of America living in a bubble, not seeing the real news. They're convinced that Donald Trump hasn't lost the election, that this election is being stolen by the fake news media and by the left-leaning Democrats, and they've gone and stormed Capitol Hill, almost the same as storming the Indian Parliament. Will America, in your view, ever be able to recover from the chaos unleashed by Trump and his supporters?
Well, honestly, Rahul, I think America is at a crossroads. I think the people who were there are a microcosm of a large part of the American population who actually believes in Donald Trump. Amongst the Republicans, he still has a 90% rating, which is quite honestly quite surprising. George W. Bush had 65% left by the time he was leaving office. And what has happened today has not happened on its own. It's a culmination of what we have seen for 4 years. And I agree that maybe in November it was not obvious that this would happen, but possibly in the last week it became increasingly obvious that something like this was on the cards. The way Trump kept on putting the election in doubt and inciting people, gathering people, planning a big thing. He tweeted, come on January 6th, it's going to be wild. What else do you need? So I think the fact is that there is an alternate reality which has been created by Donald Trump using fake news, using very influential networks right from the get-go. He had Steve Bannon in there as his closest advisor, and you know what that means. So, and this alternate reality that has been created actually believes that this election has been so if the US is to recoup its position, it will depend to a large amount on how the Republican Party repairs from this moment. Do they still carry on hitching their star like so many of them did till virtually the last minute, and Ted Cruz did even now, to Donald Trump in the hope of electoral prospects? Or will they realize that a line has been crossed, that the American population will not back them unless they begin to repair and become the party of the Constitution, become the party of order that they are supposed to be?
Embarrassed by these Trump supporters and the manner in which they try to storm Capitol. We're now seeing in the Senate some of the Republican senators cut their ties with Donald Trump, but many of them left it till too late, and many in the Republican Party are being blamed for having been part of this chaos.
Well, let's parse this through. First of all, one of the things that we do so poorly is that we make sweeping assumptions about everyone. Yesterday, there were more than 2.5 million people. Less than 200 of them were responsible for swarming the Capitol building and inciting violence. There is no place for violence in our country, and I'd like to think that America has become the greatest democracy that the world history has ever seen. Okay, so we can't let less than 0.01% of people, many who have been recognized as Antifa, violent inciters. We saw that over the summer. We can't ignore the Black Lives Matter and the Antifa violence that has been happening for months in our country, and then attribute it to groups of people. The other thing we don't do well is listen. We don't listen to the voices of the people, 2 million people peacefully protesting because they feel like they've been disenfranchised. This isn't just more than stealing the election. This is assuring that we have free and fair elections. And I agree, we have to come together as a country, bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats, and work to ensure that any future election is secured and that we avoid this kind of issues related to fraud.
I didn't hear an apology or a condemnation as a representative of the Republican Party for the chaos that these Trump supporters inflicted on Capitol Hill and the message this sends about the state of democracies worldwide.
We condemn everybody who's involved with inciting violence. We got to wait to see what justice brings to who was involved. But attributing that to all 2 million people, many of them who I know that were there to peacefully protest of what they felt was a disenfranchisement of their constitutional right to vote, is also not the right answer.
Professor Sumit Ganguly, we saw also the police virtually allowing them in places, because you can't just, for example, storm the Indian Parliament and not have the security push you back. You had lax security being allowed to come in, and now you're hearing from the likes of Rick Mehta. He's saying that there are lots of people, only a few got violent. The others were sending a strong message that they don't like the manner in which the election results have been counted.
To begin with, there is not a scintilla of evidence that there was anything fraudulent or that there was any element of malfeasance in this election. This is simply a fabrication that has been promoted by President Trump and his closest allies, and they have not been able to produce a shred of evidence that would suggest that this election was compromised in any fashion. I want to be abundantly clear on this point. Secondly, it is also clear that the Capitol Hill police were abjectly unprepared for the onslaught, even though there was ample evidence of people gathering to wreak havoc on the Capitol Hill grounds. This was not only a failure of intelligence on their part, but this was a failure of preparation. And let me suggest a thought experiment for a second. Imagine for a moment if these people had been black or brown, they would have been mowed down by the police and the National Guard, as has been the treatment of the Black Lives Matter movement earlier this summer that was referred to just earlier by the previous speaker. The notion that somehow or other that BLM posed a threat to the United States and to all is just laughable.
Can I just hold you there and show our viewers this report on precisely the point that you're making, comparing last year's Black Lives Matter protests and the manner in which the law enforcement agencies dealt with those protesters with what happened at Capitol Hill on Thursday morning. Take a look.
That runs right through the spine of American society. We cannot elide over this tragic fact. And this has been brought to the fore by the demonstrations that have taken place over the course of the past year. And of course, it has to also be attributed to the Trump Justice Department, which has had completely differential standards for black people and for white protesters. White protesters are dismissed as being as mentally unstable, as being marginal, as being fringe groups, but black protesters are depicted as terrorists and potential threats to the republic. There is a blatant double standard, and Trump has legitimized this double standard, and William Barr, his recently resigned Attorney General, in large part presided over this ever since he was in office.
Ambassador Sarna, what are the larger geopolitical consequences? You very naturally have, Xi Jinping in Beijing rubbing his hands in glee, smiling and laughing, because this is not just a repudiation of Donald Trump, but of the American order, of the American way of life, of America's values which they like to export. Now China can turn around and say that look at how we run our system in an authoritarian fashion. We seem to be doing better than a liberal democracy. Will these Trump years and what we've seen at Capitol Hill hasten China's rise and America's decline?
I think this moment of glee will pass soon enough. If Donald Trump wanted to make the wicket stickier for Joe Biden, he has succeeded. So Biden will have to work harder. The US will have to recover its credibility first by demonstrating strength at home, both in the control of the pandemic, as well as the control of the economy, as well as the control over the process of social healing. I don't think they are in the game of trying to convert China's values. I think China and Russia will be dealt with by the United States on the given paradigms that they have been dealt with for so many years. There will be differences in terms of how Biden deals with China and how Trump was dealing with China. Clearly, Biden will believe in more engagement, more cooperation, and yes, competition, but perhaps not blunt confrontation. So I think the short answer is that the US will have to recover its credibility, both at home and abroad. And I think Biden's way of doing it will be through engagement with allies, engagement with partners, engagement with international organizations. But yes, he's probably been taken down, put 10 points behind in his effort, which would in any case have been tough.
No. One is the challenges that face Joe Biden at this moment, Sadanand Dhume. The other is the message this is sent to countries across the world. Look at, for example, how China dealt with COVID-19, how the United States is dealing with COVID-19 at this moment, how this transition is taking place from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. All of it suggesting that there is something now seriously wrong with America, that this is no longer the United States that the world once dealt with, that this is a country now in terminal decline.
Look, Rahul, I think that any fair-minded person would have to concede that the events of yesterday were not the best advertisement for democracy. And it's certainly true that authoritarians around the world and people around the world who have sympathy for these authoritarian systems are going to use this to point to the superiority of an authoritarian system over a democracy. But I don't think any of us who support democracy have ever claimed that democracy is perfectly clear and clean and never messy. Of course, democracy is messy. I think what happened yesterday was excessive, but the general chaotic, contentious nature of democracy, which is rooted in debate and discussion, has always been a phenomenon. We've always seen that as part of US life, but certainly not been a phenomenon in China. And I would argue that for all its problems, in the end, and we have a long, long history that shows this, in the end, a democratic system has deeper shock absorbers and is able to kind of contain disagreements that always exist in any society, particularly in a diverse society, far more effectively than this top-down Chinese model that may look attractive and certainly is effective over periods of time, perhaps over a few years, in this case over the past 4 decades, since around 1980 or so. But I would certainly not bet in the long term on an authoritarian top-down model being providing more stability than a democratic model.
Sumit Ganguly, the same question to you. Do you think this hastens America's decline? What's the message it sends to China?
I don't, despite the disarray that currently characterizes American politics, I don't think I would make any long-term inferences about American decline. I think President Biden will restore many of the relationships that Trump had significantly frayed over the last 4 years, that he will provide suitable leadership both at home and abroad. He will restore a degree of comity to American life. And while the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians and other authoritarian states are feeling gleeful at the moment, I think their glee will be short-lived.
Social media platforms have blocked President Trump from Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. This crackdown becomes the latest addition to Trump's list of infamy, making him the first world leader to have been blocked out on social media.
Chaos in the capital of United States. A pro-Trump mob laying siege to the supreme US seat of power for hours. And President Donald Trump fanning the flames of unrest online, leading to social media giants to firmly put their foot down. Twitter, in an unprecedented move, removed 3 of US president's tweets which incited violence and made baseless claims on electoral fraud. Before this, Twitter has flagged several tweets of Trump but had never removed them. Twitter also locked Trump's account for 12 hours and threatened permanent suspension. Facebook followed suit, blocking Trump's account for 24 hours, citing 2 policy violations. It also removed Trump's controversial video urging his supporters who stormed the Capitol to go home while claiming poll fraud.
This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to have peace.
Facebook-owned Instagram also imposed a 24-hour ban on Trump. YouTube also removed a video by Trump from its platform. The outgoing US president, who could face impeachment, stands accused of using social media to stage an unofficial coup. Bureau Report, India Today.
I'm now joined on the show by Helen Lee Bougis, expert in social media, fake news, has been studying how Donald Trump has been using social media to try and whip up this hysteria, build the specter of fake news, and use that fake news on social media to engineer a real-life insurrection. Can you share, Helen, your analysis so far on the extent to which fake news was responsible for the chaos that we saw on Capitol Hill?
I think fake news is a real issue actually for both elections, not just this current election. But if you remember, the term fake news was coined actually 4 years ago with the misinformation that came out of Macedonia talking about the Pope actually being a supporter of Trump in the election. The real issue now is not just misinformation, but disinformation, and disinformation being about hoaxes and actual outright deliberate lies rather than just misconceived notions. The real challenge, as you indicated in the reporting, is the role that true social media plays into this creation of a monster situation where people have extreme views. And let me elaborate. Today in the US, over 90% of the information that people gather, unfortunately, is not through journals like yourselves, but actually via directly the social media. Now, as we all know, social media, their business model is actually to have more eyeballs and for people to stay online longer. And so what this means is their algorithm is structured to actually prey on people's emotions and actually continue to only see their point of view and not opposing points of view. And so when we start preying on people's emotions, the capacity of people to take a step back and say, is this logical? Have I checked the source of where this information is coming from? Does this even make sense? A lot of that becomes diminished because people are too emotional. It's hard to do critical thinking when you're too emotional.
So that's the problem. But have you been thinking also about the possible fix? Is there a solution which we should be working on immediately to try and take the world out of this bubble of alternate reality?
I think, unfortunately, governments aren't going to be the first people who are going to take action. Clearly, the social media companies are not going to censor themselves. You pointed out about Twitter, because of so much backlash, they took Trump offline for a couple of hours. But since the election, it's been a bit random of what they were taking off or on. And that's actually been the biggest critique about Twitter, because there isn't transparency of the algorithm of what they post or what they censor, let alone giving more indication of what sources are, if there are sponsored sites that are on that are being tweeted and clickbaited. So it's not so much whether or not they fact check, it's actually this total this lack of transparency for the public to actually know how these sites are designated. So fundamentally, unfortunately, it's a longer-term solution. But what we need to do is for the people themselves to be armed better with media literacy and actually take digital detoxes, spend, I have friends who deliberately will take off social media so that they force themselves to directly read journals like yourselves, rather than going via the very narrow channel and tunnel to have tunnel vision via social media.
This is a big problem. I'm not certain there are any easy or immediate solutions, but it's important to talk about this. And Helen, I appreciate you taking out time and joining us on the Newstrack. The world reacted in shock as rioters took over the US Congress. From Prime Minister Modi to the French president, leaders condemned the violence but called for faith in America's democracy.
Hundreds of rioters marching towards the center of world's oldest democracy. A standoff at gunpoint inside the chambers of the US Senate. The world watched in shock and disbelief as rioters attacked the United States Congress. Early hours of Thursday saw Prime Minister Modi tweeting he was distressed to see the riots and violence in Washington, D.C. First reaction came from Canada's PM, Justin Trudeau. He said Canadians were saddened by the attack on American democracy. The rest of the world soon followed. German Chancellor Angela Merkel said she was angry and sad after seeing the act of anarchy.
It's a scene that feels familiar. However, the reactions of some people in the US, including media, were portrayed differently.
Emmanuel Macron expressed faith in the United States democracy.
What happened today in Washington, D.C. is not America, definitely. We believe in the strength of our democracies. We believe in the strength of American democracy.
Those comments.
Australia urged a peaceful transfer of power. China, meanwhile, compared the riots to the Hong Kong protests. Its foreign ministry spokeswoman, Hua Chunying, said reactions of the media were starkly different then.
We hope that the American people could enjoy peace, stability and security as soon as possible.
American democracy survived the riots by a hair's breadth last night. Now Joe Biden faces the monumental task of uniting a deeply divided nation. Bureau Report, India Today.